Hello, and welcome to today's European SharePoint Community Webinar. My name is Enda, and I am delighted to be joined by Randy Williams, Director of AvePoint Client Services, who will be talking to you about architecting solutions and systems, Randy's secrets to success. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP, and our hashtag is ESPC15. Randy will be speaking at European SharePoint Conference 2015 in Stockholm this November. Randy will be speaking about transitioning your SharePoint solutions to Office 365 and Azure. He will be joined by some of the top names in SharePoint, and we are delighted to announce that Jeff Teeper will join Seth Patton and Bill Beer for the opening keynote, where they will share their roadmap for SharePoint and OneDrive. Luckily, we still have some fantastic group booking rate discounts for the European SharePoint Conference 2015. Go to sharepointeurope.com for more information. After the webinar, we will have a Q&A session. Type any questions you have for Randy in the question pane in the control panel. Some questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass over to our webinar presenter, Randy Williams. Hello, Randy. Sorry, we are just having some small technical difficulties, but if you bear with us, we will have it sorted in very shortly. Hi, Randy.
Hi, sorry, I had a network glitch on my side with the hotel. Back on.
That is no problem. And now we're just handing over to Randy, and we have all our technical difficulties sorted. So over to you, Randy.
Very good. Good afternoon. Welcome to our event. Looking forward to covering a lot of great content in our session today. So let's go ahead and get started. We've got a lot to talk about. So again, my name is Randy Williams, and calling to you today from lovely Washington, D.C. in the United States, where we have Pope Mania going on today. He's actually speaking to our U.S. Congress going on right now. I'm getting my slides ready to go here. You'll be able to see those in just a moment. All right, so again, just a teeny bit about me just real quickly as we get going here. So my name is Randy Williams. I'm a Vice President for our AvePoint Client Services team. That's actually our services arm that helps create solutions based on our products and some other custom development that we glue in. The easiest way to describe my role for AvePoint is I help our customers maximize their investments in information management. Typically, at least in the last few years, it's been centered around SharePoint, but it does get into other platforms as well, typically on the Microsoft stack. I currently call San Diego home. Very lucky to be able to live in quite a lovely place. I've been there for the last 4 years or so. Prior to that, I spent some time in Singapore and in Hawaii. So one pattern you'll note that is I actually do like warm weather. So that's not a coincidence. And I've done a little bit of writing, so I'm actually having discussions right now on perhaps another title on SharePoint 2016. But just a few of my other titles you can see here, and my most recent one that's on the shelves is the Inside Out Microsoft Press SharePoint 2013 administration. But enough about me. This is really about giving you guys hopefully some great content on architecting your systems to success. So let's first start talking about some base principles that I want to cover and really just kind of point out what might seem like the obvious, but I think it's a pretty important aspect that we do want to make sure we start with, and that's really make sure that we know what the requirements are. And really my perspective with this is not that you are going to avoid getting the requirements. What I really mean about this is you really want to make sure that the business comes first in that conversation. I know in a lot of cases, and this is very true with SharePoint deployments that we see, is that we'll see people that lead with technology first, and they'll often talk about how cool new features are, great new things in, for example, SharePoint 2016 or in Office 365, but they're really not looking hard enough about how is the business going to be engaged, how are they going to be able to change what they do day to day, and really get value out of that system. So I really want to make sure you guys all recognize the business really does need to come first, and it's then architecting a solution that's going to meet that business need. Now, as part of that, there are oftentimes a number of non-functional requirements, as we often call them, that you want to make sure you're considering. A few of the bullets are listed on the screen that you want to make sure that you're getting good answers to. How many people are going to use it? What are the security requirements? How long is the system expected to live? Things of that nature. And then the idea here is you want to try to get these as much, you want to try to get answers to these as much as possible, but you're probably going to find that you're just not going to get answers to some of them. I mean, I've been working in the field now for 25 years, and this aspect hasn't changed in that time, so getting really good details on this doesn't happen. So what you really have to do as an architect, if you're not able to get this input, it's up to you then to come up with assumptions. Basically define what you believe that requirement to be. You state that as an assumption, and that's what you're going to then architect your system to. So, for example, if you're not told how many users are going to use the system, you need to come up with a number, and that's going to be the number that will become your target when you make your architectural choices. So that's something you do need to come up with. Make sure that's documented, and share that with the rest of the team and your constituents who you're working with. All right, and then bottom line is really the success of your design is going to be based on whether it meets these requirements. And I'll touch on that point a little bit more as we get towards the end of our deck, kind of bring it full circle, you might say. So as we start getting into the architectural aspect of this, one of the things that you're going to notice is there's all these what I like to call trade-off considerations. And really all design elements within a solution involve these. And the idea is that you have these sort of competing requirements. If I end up choosing option A, it's going to mean these kinds of things. If I end up going with option B, it's going to be these kinds of things. So what I like to do is I'm looking at the different choices, is I'm really trying to kind of weigh out the advantages and disadvantages of each aspect to make sure that I'm really looking at things in a balanced and fair way and then deciding what I want to do. Keep in mind that no choice is ever going to be a perfectly obvious choice. So again, it's really about being able to weigh and consider all the evidence before you make a decision. One common example is, let's say that you're going to be building some SharePoint add-ins and you're going to be having some provider-hosted apps, and you need to decide whether you're going to host that in an on-premises application environment, let's say an IIS web farm, versus, say, Azure websites, for example. And so there's obviously trade-off considerations, pros and cons of each of those choices, and you want to make sure that you're looking at those to make sure that you're, again, looking at all aspects. And the analogy that I like to use is an architect is kind of like a judge, right? He's the one, he or she, is the one that's looking at all the different aspects and really then hopefully making a fair and balanced decision based on that input. So I hope that makes sense. So in my conversations with customers and fellow architects, I'm really always asking them to make sure they understand the trade-off considerations and they're doing that. And then perhaps maybe the most important but often overlooked trade-off consideration is really ROI, right? And again, because at the end of the day, this comes back to the business. It's about money, and can you really look at the choices that you're making to determine if the value and the cost is going to work out in a way that, long term, you're going to make money on this. And this is not one of those things where it's easy to quantify everything. So in some cases, you're trying to make a guess. Maybe there's some quality-like factors that you're measuring that it's hard to attach a monetary figure to. But at the end of the day, you really do want to make sure that you're able to justify the investment. And whether you want to measure that in how many months or how many years that ROI will take, that's a common option too. But again, let's just not forget the true economics that are oftentimes driving the choices that we're making. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to spend a few minutes then and cover some of the key infrastructure architecture aspects that you get into. And this is one of the roles that I play on many projects as I go into the customers and I talk with their various infrastructure people, so people running the servers and the networks and DBAs and storage folks and such, and really try to kind of tease out what their environment looks like, what are their build standards, what are some of their what are some of the things that they have today that can influence how our design is going to be built. So, for example, is it going to be virtualized versus physical? Although almost everything is virtual today, how and where are those physical servers going to be placed, and are we architecting them in a way that makes sense from a disaster recovery point of view and a performance point of view? So on the slide that you're seeing right now, this is really most of the considerations from a server point of view. Scalability is oftentimes a very common question because, again, many customers can't really articulate what is going to be the usage count. So, for example, with SharePoint, if adoption is incredibly successful, you might have a demand that could be 10 times greater than what was expected, and you want to make sure that your system is able to scale up to meet that demand. And when we talk about that demand, does that scaling need to be done in a dynamic way? So, for example, you might have a situation where you have a customer that has a seasonal business, and during a certain time of the year, let's say during tax season, you have a very, very heavy usage, but then it kind of tapers off for the rest of the months. Or maybe that demand scales during certain times of the day, most obviously during normal working hours, but during the evening and early morning, it's much lighter. So does your system need to be able to scale based on those demand patterns? And can it even scale when it's an unpredictable load? And that's where some of the cloud that we'll talk about later is quite useful. Of course, fault tolerance is an aspect as well. Right? You never want to have a single point of failure across really any component. When you're looking at servers, it's typically what is my CPU core count versus memory going to be looking like? And from a SharePoint point of view, if most of you guys are architecting from that side, then know that memory, by and large, is the most important of the factors. But if maybe you're developing a custom application that, let's say, uses a machine learning library, those tend to be pretty CPU heavy because there's a lot of calculations and kind of number crunching and such that it goes through. So those could be more CPU based. So part of it is knowing a little bit about the workload to make sure that you've got the right balance of hardware they're constructed, whether it's virtual or physical. And of course, again, for the SharePoint folks on the call, you're certainly looking at the various roles that you would have as well, right? So your web servers, app servers, distributed cache, database, etc. Okay, and then as we talk about storage, and I'm not going to get too much in the details on this because this perspective has really gotten simplified over the last few years with a lot of the SAN stores that we have out there. So we don't get into detail in architecting RAID like we used to 10 or 15 years ago. Really, bottom line, when I have conversations with my customers around storage, it's mostly around how many spindles can they make sure that are available, and are they able to measure the total number of IOPS that particular LUN, that logical unit device, is going to be able to provide. And from a SharePoint point of view, we like to target 1.0 IOPS per gigabyte of storage. So for example, if you think you're going to have a 500 gigabyte content database, which is maybe a little bit larger than the recommended size, but it's still pretty common. So a 500 gigabyte content database, you'd want to make sure that the storage in which that's sitting can provide at least 500 IOPS. And nowadays with storage and certainly with solid state drives, that type of target is not really a problem at all anymore. So from a storage point of view, again, it's still very important, and storage is a huge aspect, or storage speed, I should say, is a huge aspect to the overall response time, at least from a SharePoint environment, but it's not as tricky as it used to be. All right, and then from a database point of view, and I'm kind of speaking to this with the assumption that you might be creating a custom application and your back-end database platform is something you may need to make the choice on. I would say, 4 out of 5 times for all the systems that I've architected in the last almost 20 years have been SQL-based, but there are some occasional situations where you really don't need either that license or the kinds of features that a distributed relational database platform gives you. So this is where NoSQL or perhaps Hadoop are other common choices. So things that you're asking is whether you need transactional support, right? The ability to maintain a transactional consistency from the start to the end of the transaction. What about recovery? What about relational integrity? Do you need to think about how the at-rest encryption for that data storage is going to be? Can you back up and restore that in an easy and consistent way? And of course, most of those questions are things that SQL has done very, very well for the last few years. And then lastly, as you see, performance is often a consideration. And back to SharePoint for a moment, this is a particularly big one, and I speak to this, and this is a whole separate conversation. But just to make the key point is that the larger that a database gets, in this case a content database, the slower that the performance is going to become. And that's really the primary reason why Microsoft and others across the community advocate keeping content databases on a diet, keep them relatively small. Even that 200 gigabyte magic number is still pretty commonly used. And again, it's largely to ensure that the overall performance of that can be quite efficient. All right, so moving on, of course, there is a network dimension here as well. And there's really kind of two aspects to the network side. One is from an infrastructure point of view. So it's actually looking at the switches, it's looking at the load balancers, it's looking at the physical network cards, your NICs that your servers have. It's how you can team them. It's basically doing whatever you can to get the best aggregated throughput. Do you need to have separate networks for server-to-server traffic versus client-to-server traffic? That's oftentimes the conversation point that comes up. And then as you're aside from the infrastructure side, as you're starting to get more into the application and perhaps app dev aspect to this, is making sure that you're configuring that application to leverage caching where possible. So, for example, in an IIS context, including SharePoint, you may choose to enable blob caching within your web config file. You might take advantage of tools like Riverbed to be able to do application caching across the WAN. And even from a dev point of view, you're starting to see how you can be more efficient in using that network. So, for example, let's say you're writing a SharePoint add-in, and there's going to be some client-side object model calls that are originating from the browser within JavaScript. You'd want to make sure that you're kind of smart about how many round trips are you going to need, so that kind of back and forth communication between browser and web front end, you can reduce the overall number of round trips. So lots of aspects to this, from the dev to the configuration to the infrastructure side, and networks being what they are, right? It is finite bandwidth, and the latency that you actually have is something that, especially as you're talking about cross-continental applications, is something you really can't improve, right? Latency being what it is, it's just going to take X number of milliseconds for packets to go from point A to point B. Okay, so with that, I'm going to transition into the cloud for just a couple of minutes here before I start getting into all my tips for secrets to your success. But the cloud is changing in a major way. So it's really causing us to rethink the patterns and the experiences that we've had in the past. And even though you may not be using cloud today, the cloud is nonetheless still going to influence choices that you make, because I'm pretty sure that the cloud is going to be it's going to be in your future at some point, whether completely all in or in some type of hybrid state. So you do want to make sure you're thinking about that. We're not going to get into the details about the differences or distinctions in all of these. I would guess that most of you by now are pretty clear on the differences between IaaS and PaaS and SaaS as far as your different cloud hosting options. Just very quickly, from a SharePoint point of view, if let's say I want to host my SharePoint farm inside AWS, or let's say inside Azure VMs, that would be an IaaS solution, whereas a SaaS solution would be an example of Office 365 that I'm hosting. And just a couple of the key points that where cloud tends to change the perspective in a big way is around elasticity and scalability. So when I say elasticity, it's the ability to grow and shrink. It's that scale on demand that we talked about earlier that is really such a great, wonderful benefit. And that elasticity you get really quite well within the PaaS offerings, And for the most part within SaaS offerings as well, not so much from the IaaS because you still have to spin up new VMs and make sure that those get configured properly. So big proponent of that, and also the pay-as-you-use model, right? So this again goes back to the economics of this and basically getting this out of a capital expense, right, where I have a big upfront cost, and now monetizing that over a series of months. And as you start thinking about startups and other companies that are just now starting to build their future business model, and being able to start up in a much easier way is going to reduce their startup costs, reduce the loans they have to take from the bank, and really just gives them greater agility in getting off the ground much more quickly. Now that said, I would say, and this is the consideration on the cloud side, is even though there might be cloud interest and perhaps even movement to the cloud you've already been making, most organizations that I still work with have a sizable or very significant investment still in on-premises infrastructure. Whether that may not be SharePoint, but there are other aspects of content. Let's say it's documents and file shares, it's content within line of database systems that need to be somehow exposed. Certainly Active Directory and perhaps other types of on-premises infrastructure is still there. So that's where the hybrid aspect becomes a little bit more of a challenge. And while Microsoft and others are doing, I think, a fair amount of work in this, there's still a long way to go. Identity management and really the federation of identities to achieve true single sign-on is still particularly challenging, even though it's getting better, for example, with Azure Connect. Being able to expose the right data to the right users, where that data lives on premises through the cloud is particularly tricky. How do you then expose this to business partners that, let's say, live outside your organization, vendors and others that you work with? How can you make sure that they're getting access to the right data? So this is not always a technical question. Sometimes this is really revisiting the business and trying to make sure that you can get really good clarity on what their degree of comfort is on what kind of information should be exposed. And this is where it can also get complex as you start talking to risk officers, privacy officers, InfoSec personnel. Usually there are a lot of different stakeholders that have an opinion on the cloud, and some of them love it, some of them hate it, and the architect in some ways is kind of caught in the middle, being pulled in lots of different directions. So as great as the cloud is, it certainly does come with its own challenges as well. Okay, so with that, we've still got a good amount of time here. I want to spend some time talking through my tips for success. So I've got just lots of different bullets here, and I'll be kind of walking through some stories and some different examples as we get into the second half of this talk here. All right, so as we're starting off here, one of the things I want to make sure that you recognize, and this is probably obvious for most of you, but it's a common mistake I see people make, is do you actually know the platform? In other words, are you going to try to architect something on a platform that you don't really understand? So, for example, let's say that you're going to be building a kind of next-generation application. You're going to host it inside a series of VMs inside Amazon Web Services, but you've never worked with Amazon. You don't understand how their virtual clouds are configured. You've never configured the virtual networking between on-premises and such. So you really do want to make sure you're doing your homework. Take this as an opportunity to increase your skills, learn that platform, understand its intricacies, know the trade-off considerations as we've talked about. Basically, do your homework, right? Architects, they get paid the big bucks for a good reason. They are seasoned professionals. They've got lots of experience, and that experience is something that is continually growing because technology and your choices are always changing. So my point is you can't rest on your laurels. Continue to invest in your career and your experience base as you encounter a new problem and perhaps a new opportunity. You also want to make sure you're researching other patterns and practices. It's very likely that someone else designed something very similar, and I see this as a mistake that a lot of, I would say, novice architects make, or even sometimes maybe more senior ones, where they really feel like, hey, I'm an expert in this, and I know more than anybody else in this particular space. And because of that, there's this kind of arrogance where they think that they have to come up with these sort of killer, no one has ever done this before like the idea and try to implement it. In reality, someone else has probably done something before in this area. They're the design that others have come up with has probably been done quite a few times. It's trusted, it's known, it works. So as an architect, I think in many cases you really need to take your ego out of the equation. It's not about what you know and about proving what your experience is. It's about coming up with a design that's going to work best in this situation. So again, I'm a big believer at looking at patterns and practices, find out what other people have done, reach out to some of the social communities to make sure that you're reaching out to others. And this is one of the things about the SharePoint community that I absolutely love. There's so many brilliant people that are out there that are very eager and helpful and willing to share their knowledge with you. So you really want to take advantage of that as much as you can. And one great way of being able to do that is to be able to attend events like the European SharePoint Conference coming up. Having the chance to network with the people oftentimes is even of greater value than attending the sessions. Be careful when you take shortcuts. This is another common mistake I see people take. Experts can often get away with it, but for most people, I really don't recommend it. So, for example, let's say that you are going to be working on a custom web database application. We'll say it's not SharePoint, it's just a custom ASP.NET web application, and you're just going to assume that I know SQL Server is going to be the right database, and I know that it's going to be, the table schema is going to be architected in third normal form because that's what I've done for the last 5 other applications, and you're basically making assumptions without going through a proper exercise. Now, I'm not saying you have to look at every possible option and spend a laborious amount of time, but just be careful. I still continue to make shortcuts that I often regret later. I'm pretty disciplined now, and I kind of know where I can, and I should not be taking shortcuts. So my basic advice is until you become a seasoned professional, you really know what you're doing. If you don't know if you can safely take a shortcut, your best advice is probably not to take it. Okay, and then another big one that I'm a big proponent on is, can you explain your design to your peers or document it properly? One of the problems that I have, and this oftentimes goes back to some of the more senior architects that, again, may have a big ego and perhaps some arrogance attached to their history. They feel like their design is so great, it's so amazing that other people aren't going to understand it, so I'm not going to bother explaining it. And I find that to be incredibly risky. There's really no design that is so amazing that can't be broken down into a series of pieces and then explained to somebody else. So whenever someone does that to me that really tells me that they either don't know the design well enough and they need to refine and refactor a little bit more, or they're just a terrible communicator. In either case, it's risky, right? If let's say that I'm on an architecture review panel and I'm reviewing someone else's architecture, if they can't really articulate to me some of the trade-off considerations and answer my questions well, again, that really tells me that they haven't thought through the design well enough. And they might be brilliant, but the reality is that architecture has to be known to the team. Others have to be able to understand it, and just knowing that it's in the mind of one person is really not good enough. Okay? So sometimes a statement that I'll often use is, pretend I'm a 10-year-old, and now walk through your design one more time. And that's a little bit of a joke, because I don't really expect them to treat me like a 10-year-old, but it's really breaking it down into the most simple terms and explain it to me as if I knew nothing at all. Okay? A little bit hard to do, but some of the best communicators and the best educators can do that incredibly well. So it's a skill that's certainly getting strong. It's worth getting stronger at. Okay, and then recognize that when you're doing architecture, it's going to be done in layers. In some cases, maybe that architecture is going to be done from back to front. So let's say I'm going to architect my back end first. I'm then going to be working on the middle layer, let's say, which is going to be a series of object classes that I'll be exposing to the front end, which we'll say is a web-based application, maybe AngularJS, and calling into some web services using jQuery. So in that particular case, I might choose to architect from back to front. That would be an example of an end-tier design. But in some cases, you might architect from high levels to low levels. So I might paint the broad picture first, and then kind of sort of like peeling the onion, I'll start breaking it down one additional layer at a time. So Maybe if I'm talking about the middle layer, we'll assume that it's maybe some web services in this case. I might at least define what the web service platform is. Let's say it's going to be WCF that's running on top of an IIS web farm. And then I'll go in and I'll start describing all my interfaces. And then once the interfaces are described, then I kind of know that those are the right interfaces that my client are going to need. I'll then go in and start stubbing those out, and then maybe even writing unit tests to get those established, and then finally actually then writing the code to implement each of the interfaces. So that would be an example of going from high levels to lower levels. All right, so moving on here. Here's a common question that I get a lot. What is the right level of detail for your design? And it's really a hard question to answer because I don't think there's any one right answer. Is a Visio diagram good enough? Is a series of PowerPoints good enough? Should it be a narrative inside Microsoft Word? So just like there's not any one right document format, there's not also one right level of detail. It really depends on the platform that you're working on. It depends on the team that you're communicating with. Bottom line, and this is the short answer that I give, is at what point can you hand this architecture off to an implementation team and know that they're going to be able to do what they need to do, right? So if we take ourselves out of the software business for a moment and we pretend that we're architecting houses, right? At what point is that blueprint that you're producing for the house, when can that be handed off to a contractor team to build that house and know that it's going to be built correctly? So that's really what you have to ask yourself. And this is, again, where that communication starts becoming very important. You're reviewing this design with your peers, with an architectural review board, if you have something with that, with the project team. So it's evolving as they're looking at it. And at some point, you all agree that, hey, this is good enough, right? This is enough detail. We're ready to jump forward with this. Let's go. I hope that helps. And then again, I've said this a couple times already, be sure to consult others on your design. Right? Don't be afraid to let other people look at it. And as you're having that conversation and kind of walking through what you have in mind, be prepared to defend your choices. Right? We talked earlier about your trade-off considerations. So if you've made a choice to use a certain type of, let's say, third-party product to incorporate into your solution, be able to answer why you've made that choice, right? Why is it better to use Nintex instead of K2, for example? Those are questions that are very valid that you should be able to have an answer for. And feedback that you get is something that you want to make sure you take like a professional. Again, some people tend to be a little bit egocentric in some of their things, and input from anybody else is never going to be good enough because they don't know as much as I do. And I just don't believe that. I mean, I think there are a lot of different ways to architect something, and having the perspective and opinions of other people, even if they're not as skilled as you, but there's still a dimension that they can bring to this that it's possible that you have not considered before. If nothing else, if they haven't told you anything new, then, hey, that's one more peer review that you've gone through, and your design has been validated one step further. Okay? And, part of this is also to go through your check to make sure that you've done all the right things, and it's very possible you're going to learn something new. So this is also a career opportunity for you to make sure that you're still growing and learning and honing your skill. And then keep in mind that there aren't any perfect designs. So your goal should never be to create that perfect design, because they don't exist, right? We are humans. We live in an imperfect world. Houses aren't perfect. Software's not perfect. No software system's ever been released that's completely bug-free. Please don't make that your goal. It's an impossible expectation of yourself. And I oftentimes call this pole polishing. Right? At some point, that pole is polished well enough. You can keep polishing it for another couple days. It's not going to get any shinier. So at some point, it's good enough. Get it out the door. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Okay. Designs are not really right or wrong. And this is something where I think you probably have a big debate on. I think there are very few things in the world that are truly black and white. And again, the world we live in is very colorful. There's lots of shades of gray and hues of every color within the spectrum. And I think that applies to designs. So it's very common, for example, for me to butt head with some of my peers because I'm going into an architectural a project with one perspective, and let's say my colleague, she's coming into it from another perspective, and we just don't see eye to eye. And that's actually not a bad thing, right? I mean, it's an opportunity for me to learn from her and perhaps for her to learn from me. So this is really where that kind of peer collaboration is so very important. But it's really, and it's not really to say your design is bad or it's wrong. It's that, again, when we look at the requirements and we look at what we're really trying to achieve and consider all the constraints, right, cost, schedule, budget, quality, etc., can the design that you make meet the constraints that the project has, bottom line. And that's really what, to me, is really the only thing that matters, whether the design is right or wrong. So consider the adage: a good plan today is better than a plan tomorrow, than a great plan tomorrow. So do you think this applies to architecting solutions? Well, I kind of go back and forth on this, and really the idea is, again, recognizing that designs are not perfect. They never will be. And I find that a lot of architects that are still coming up to speed and really kind of growing their talent, they have the belief that, again, the architect, the architect that you provide is going to be so great, it's going to be so perfect, everyone's going to love you, and it's going to be amazing. And that just doesn't exist. I mean, the architecture, of course, is important, but it's not so important that you spend weeks or months of time on it. You really just have to keep in mind that there are real-life constraints that require you to get this out the door. And I oftentimes find if you start working on it too much, you really start putting yourself into a situation where you're paralyzed. You continue to question yourself, you second-guess your options, you tear it apart, and you come up with it again. And the second time you do that isn't always better than the first time. Now, that's not to say that the first design is always the best design, but my point is again, back to the adage, sometimes and many times the plan is going to be good enough today. If I wait longer to come up with a slightly better plan, it might be too late. Okay? Business expects to move forward very, very quickly. We need to remain agile, and for us to do that, we've got to keep the momentum going forward. Okay, but again, this is also a balancing act, and this kind of goes back to the trade-off considerations that I said. You don't want to rush it either, right? You do want to give it proper time. I've been on lots of projects, and one of my roles at AvePoint is to do review of architectural patterns, not patterns necessarily, but review architectures that others have come up with. And I can just speak to one, for example. It was a big project that we worked on in Singapore for the past couple of years, and there were some choices that were made in the architecture, and it really wasn't properly architected, and that's just the reality in some projects if you don't have the right team put together, where they had made some choices and made some assumptions on how SharePoint worked, and as I looked at it 2 or 3 months after the design is done and the development had already started, I realized that some of this just isn't going to work. And we really had to stop development in a couple of key areas of that application to really back up and to redo some of that. Now, in the end, we still ended up meeting the schedule, and it worked out fine. And I'm glad we caught it at the time we caught it, because if we would have waited a few more months, it could have delayed the project in a very serious way. So again, this is about finding the right balance, right? So you want to put the right amount of time into it. And knowing if it's too much or too little is hard, and this is, again, where peer review and having some input with others is very, very helpful. Okay, make sure you have the architecture ready before you start development. I see this a lot. This is not really a problem at AvePoint, but at other places that I've worked in the past, there's what I like to call the whiskey principle. Whiskey, why isn't Sammy coding yet? It's the belief that a software development shop should be starting to develop as soon as possible, maybe even day one. And right, developers love to write code. That's the passion they have. That's why they're in this business. And it actually takes discipline to come up with the right design and come up with an architecture and start to test it out, maybe doing some prototyping on it to really validate that that's the right choice before you start jumping in and writing code. And I just find that too many development teams tend to rush the software development itself, and maybe even prototyping, that's what they say, but the reality is it's prototyping that ends up becoming the real system. So I would just say be very careful about when you do that. If you're going to be doing prototyping, and it's very common to do that, I would say expect that to be throwaway code, right? It's not the type of code that's going to be of the quality that you want to make in the final production-ready system. And at the same time, make sure you do what you can to avoid the whiskey principle, right? Sammy doesn't have to start coding day one. If he does, then it's very, very likely that he's going to have to rework some of his code. Or if you choose not to rework the code, you're affecting the quality at some point in the end. Simple designs are almost always better than complex designs. Now, I'm not saying they always are, but in general they are. Again, I'm a very big believer that overly complex designs more times than not just tend to fail. Even if they're brilliant designs, and again, one architect has just an amazing vision and an amazing talent, if that can't be communicated effectively to the rest of the team, where other people can get that same mind meld and that same kind of mental clarity on what needs to be done, the truth is that you're going to have a disconnect, and the implementation is probably going to suffer. So again, keep it simple, make it work, make sure it's going to hit the requirements, and that's good enough. And this is another thing that comes up, right? So make sure you can think about how you can prove that your design is the best choice. This is a little bit tricky, right? Because this gets into all kinds of aspects. If it's a custom application, are you doing all the right types of not just regression testing, but user acceptance testing to really make sure it passes the muster? If you're talking about infrastructure, architecture, are you doing the right things to make sure that you have the right number of servers? And this is something that could really go on, in a perpetual way that you have to be careful about. Testing a design is something that could take weeks or months. Do you actually have weeks or months? Probably not. So the testing should be consistent with the amount of time that you feel is necessary to prove out the design to some stage. It's never going to be proven out perfectly, because the only way to really prove that design is you actually get it in production and real users use it in a real-life way. And you're never going to be able to resemble that in almost all cases in solutions that you build. So prove it out the best you can, but know that there's still some risks with that. And you put in a fudge factor. So, like for example, if based on the number of users and the types of activities that I'm going to see in my SharePoint farm, you can probably get away with 16 gigs of RAM on each web front end. Well, I'm probably going to bump that up a little bit, put in a little bit of cushion, put in a little bit of buffer. Again, that's kind of my contingency to make sure that if something changes, then I still have some capacity to be able to accommodate that. And from a code point of view, I'm a big believer of keeping the units of code as decoupled as possible. And when I say decoupled, what I really mean is try not to build a system in a very, tightly coupled monolithic style, right? This is the big reason that N-tier design has become so important, is to make sure that I can create systems that are relatively independent in nature. My UI is relatively independent from my middle tier, and my middle tier is relatively separate from my database tier. And obviously there's interfaces that communicate and connect all those together. But if I need to substitute out, let's say, one layer at some point in the future, at that point, I'm not trying to untangle this hairball and trying to figure out how I can suture the new system together. I'm just sort of detaching one, I'm reattaching the other, I plug it all back in, the interface is aligned, and it still works. I know it's easy to say, hard to do, but you do want to think about the coupling of your systems and make it as modular as possible. You may not need it for now, but if you ever expect to enhance or evolve this over time, you'll be grateful that you did that. All right, so what else do we have here? So I talked about this a little bit before, but I'm going to just mention it again. No one knows everything, so don't try to be an expert across all areas, right? Your goal isn't to become a perfect architect. Your goal is to create a great system that can be communicated to the team that's going to meet the requirements of the system. That's the goal. It's not about you. It's not about your ego. It's about developing a great system that's going to deliver business value. So some of the ways that I do this, and this is actually oftentimes the same career advice I give for people that are, let's say, coming up in the IT world and ask me what I've done and what do I suggest. My recommendation is to start with a good generalist knowledge about how things work. Right? Make sure you have a good, as I like to call it, big picture understanding. Right? Understand how systems work. If you're going to be more of an IT professional, understand servers, understand networks, make sure you understand the OSI model, make sure you recognize how SharePoint and the operating system will work together. Maybe you have certifications, maybe you picked up some of that in college, maybe you're a self-learner, whatever it is so that you've got that skill, make sure you can basically, in your mind, understand how the basic pieces all fit together. So that's where you start. And then find those specific areas where you really want to specialize in. Right? So these are going to be your areas that you are a subject matter expert in. So you might have good generalist knowledge from an IT pro point of view, and now I'm going to get really, really good at architecting storage or architecting identity management for cloud hybrid, or I'm going to get really good at architecting how, let's say, the back-end database for systems are going to work. And it doesn't have to be one area. Maybe it's a few areas. But when you choose those areas of specialty, I'm a big believer that should align with things that you love, right? Those should be the things that you're most passionate about. And for me, the best way to succeed in IT is to do what you like, right? If it's just a job, if it's just you wake up at 8, you go to the office at 8 a.m. and you come home at 5 and you can't wait for your vacation and you're really just getting a paycheck, to me that's not the best way to succeed in IT. Because the truth is it's not a normal 8 to 5 job. It is a different type of career. There is a much greater pay potential, but that assumes that you're really going to put in that commitment. And for you to put in the commitment and put in the time to get stronger, to learn more, and be able to excel, what you can deliver to your employer or as a consultant to your customers, that implies that you're continually learning and you're understanding more and making better distinctions and making better decisions. For you to do all that and put in the time and make that effort, you've got to love what you're doing. Otherwise, now, instead of doing 40 hours of work that you hate, you're doing 60 hours of work that you hate. And I'm kind of joking a little bit, but I'm kind of serious about this too. When I look at my life here at AvePoint in my prior careers, yeah, I usually put in 60 hours of work. But really what I do, I have about 40 hours of play and 20 hours of work. And, that works for me. Every job's going to have stuff you don't like to do. But if you love what you're doing, if you found your passion and you align your work career to your passion, that's really the secret to happiness in my book. So do what you love, make your heart sing, and with that, I'll bring my tips to a close and let you answer any, or excuse me, let you ask any questions you guys might have. We've got another about 13 minutes or so that we'll be online to be able to answer your questions, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. And if you don't, thank you for your time. Good luck to all of you. Hope to see some of you in Stockholm in November.
Well, that was brilliant. Thank you very much, Randy. And now we'll just kind of deal with some questions just to start. So we have 4 questions overall. So the first question, let's say I think that 6 servers, 2 web front ends, 2 app servers, and 2 database servers would be sufficient for a customer's SharePoint farm. My customer is asking, how can I guarantee that this will be sufficient for their workloads? How do I answer this?
Yeah, so that's a tough question. I see that one a lot. How can you really prove out the number of servers in an architecture? The right answer to that is it's really impossible, right? I touched on that a little bit earlier, but there is some due diligence that we can go through, and really the right answer is you want to create a series of workloads that represent what you think an average workload will be for users. So for example, let's say that I'm deploying SharePoint and it's going to be for document collaboration. I'm going to create a document collaboration workload. So I'm basically going to simulate this is what people do, right? They search for documents, they open documents, they create new versions, they create new sites, they do all the normal kind of day-to-day stuff. You actually would create that as a profile, and there's various tools that you can use this with. Visual Studio Ultimate has these kinds of capabilities. You basically script all this out, and you run that profile for X number of users, concurrent users in this case, against your servers, and you really try to, as best you can, prove out is that going to be good enough. Again, you're never going to get it exact because what you estimate that workload to be is probably not going to match what really happens Adoption levels, for example, will very likely influence the actual usage that you get. But that's why you want to build in a little bit of a buffer to also make sure that even if you've underestimated it, you've still got some room to grow.
That's perfect and very detailed, I must say. So our next question is, I need to develop some SharePoint apps now called add-ins. Can you give me some resources that can help me get started?
Yes, SharePoint add-ins. Lots and lots of resources that are out there, and this is another great example where the community has really taken shape. And really the development story for SharePoint has changed so much since SharePoint 2013 came out with apps now called add-ins. And I would say the best place to start is to really go out to the patterns and practices that Microsoft has put out there. So if you go out to dev.office.com, that really is the right place to start. If you go out to the resources section, you will see a patterns and practices area. And the reason I'm such a big fan of the patterns and practices, and we talked a bit about patterns in our talk today, is they have lots of sample code, literally hundreds of examples of sample code that's been tested, that other people are using, that you can use to get started in your environment. And the reason that I like that is not just because it's tested, but if you guys are like me, as you're learning a new environment as a developer, you basically learn by reviewing other people's code, right? That's how most people end up learning. So if I can start looking at what other people have done, I can then take that code. I have no guilt in taking and reusing that code in whole or in part in solutions that I build. This is open source information. It's all actually out on GitHub. Use that. Take advantage of it. If you can make it better, publish it back in and make the patterns and practices even better. But that's what community is all about, right? So patterns and practices is a great place to start. The other one that I'll just say very quickly, if you go out to Channel 9, and most of you probably know what that is, if you go out to Channel 9, in the MSDN area, there are literally hundreds of videos also. Many of them actually walk through the patterns and practices that I just mentioned. And if you're the kind of guy that just likes to sit back and watch someone else kind of lecture to you on how to do something, you've got that as an option. So hopefully between the two of those, that'll help you out. And really the only URL you have to remember, dev.office.com. And in fact, I'll be talking much more about that in my presentation in Stockholm in November. Got a whole talk about that.
Brilliant. I'd say there's a lot of people looking forward to that presentation in Stockholm. So we actually just have 3 more questions now, Randy. We just got a few more in just as the Q&A session was starting, but obviously we don't want to kind of keep you here all day. So our next one here is, can you give some tips on storage calculation for SharePoint on-premise?
All right. So tips for storage calculation on SharePoint. All right. So that can be a very long answer. I will try to give you a short answer, but let's start off by recognizing that there are some finite limits to how big you want content databases to be. We talked a little bit earlier in our talk today that you want to keep content databases as much as possible, at least for what I call collaboration workloads, at about 200 gigabytes. And because a site collection is actually a unit of storage in the content database, that means site collections don't get any larger than 200 gigs as well. So just kind of keep that as baseline information in your back pocket. When you actually start looking at how much space will I need, because I think that's kind of what you're asking, that's a little bit trickier. But there are some calculators that are out there, and some of them are pretty fancy, where they actually look at the number of documents that you're going to have, what the average size is, the number of versions you're going to have, and then they basically add in a multiplier to be able to then calculate the actual space. Those work pretty good. The only couple of caveats that I'll mention about that is in SharePoint 2013, with the incorporation of shredded storage, the space is actually much more efficient than previous versions of SharePoint. So make sure you get a newer calculator that works with SharePoint 2013. And the other aspect is just keep in mind there's all this extra additional overhead that SharePoint brings. So even if, let's say, I have a total aggregate size of, let's say, 100 gigabytes of documents, know that when you factor in the versions, you factor in the site overhead, you factor in, let's say, all of your crawling information, right? So your crawl logs and your index files that are maintained, all the other overhead at SharePoint, and including the overhead that SQL Server brings in, right? So you've got your data portion, you've got your log portion. To keep it very, very simple, the multiplier that I use is somewhere around 2.5. And so if you think you have 100 gigabytes of actual documents, multiply that by 2.5, the actual storage that you probably will need will be somewhere about 250 gigabytes. That's the most simple way to do it.
Right. Actually, this next question will be kind of tying into that. Is SharePoint suitable for terabytes of content?
Terabytes of content. So yes, however, there's also a caveat that goes with that. It really depends on the workload that you're talking about. So for example, we've been talking about, let's say, collaboration workloads where you have a lot of volatility, or what I like to call read and write actions. In the collaboration-like workload, you don't want content databases to get very big. Again, that performance and including the backup and recovery time is a big issue for collaboration workloads. Now, technically, Microsoft supports content databases for collaboration workloads up to 4 terabytes, provided your storage is fast enough, and there are a few other stipulations that they have, in terms of recovery tools and things like that. But technically, it goes up to 4 terabytes. And as you start looking at other workloads, let's say you've got document centers or record centers, those actually can scale quite a bit larger, and primarily because those tend to be read-only in nature. And when you start getting into read-only and you start thinking about what really happens inside SQL Server, what are called shared locks versus exclusive locks, you can actually share larger databases in a much better way without involving the same performance overhead. Your backup and restore stories a little bit better because, well, heck, the database is read-only. It doesn't change. I don't have to back it up as often. So the short answer is yes, it can be multi-terabytes. If it's collaboration workloads, put a lot of time into getting some of the best storage out there to make sure you have good performance, but still architect your databases to be fairly small. If you're talking about record centers and document centers, know that you've got more flexibility. Those get bigger. And also keep in mind that, I'm not limited, of course, to a content database. I can have dozens of content databases that are broken up into dozens or even hundreds of site collections. And if I need to, I can even start scaling out multiple clusters. So, theoretically, SharePoint can scale to infinite sizes, provided you do it in a very careful and cautious way.
Fantastic. And now we'll just move on to our final question for you, Randy. Any tips on archiving in SharePoint?
Archiving in SharePoint. That's a very good question, and one where oftentimes a third-party story gets part of the equation. And this is not really about selling AvePoint, so I won't do that to you guys here. I'll just start off by saying that SharePoint's archiving capability, it's pretty weak. It really assumes that you're going to be using information management policies, which then tie into content types, which then tie into what I assume is going to be an information architecture that you've probably come up with. It's great to talk about all those things, but most organizations, they just don't do that stuff, right? So they provision sites whenever they want. They don't really have any governance over the content lifecycle. They use the out-of-the-box content types and no information management policies. So based on that, it's really not practical or easy to archive information in SharePoint. Now, maybe if you're doing it at a site level, you can archive that. SharePoint lets you do that, although it's requires a little bit of custom script and custom code. But if you're anything more than a small organization and you really want to make sure that you're using SharePoint properly, and probably even enforcing some of the retention policies that your legal teams may in fact require you to do, the right answer is to really look at your third-party options to make sure that you can do something in a smart and fully featured way. Just keep in mind that even if you go with third-party solutions, and there are quite a few of them out there, AvePoint included, you still have some due diligence to come up with a good information architecture and a set of policies so the tools actually know how that information can be archived. I'll just add one small point there as well. When we talk about archiving, there's usually 2 stages. The first stage is typically putting that document using RBS to a cheaper form of storage. That's a form of archiving, but it's still accessible inside SharePoint. Oftentimes we call it stage 1. Stage 2 then can be where you're actually removing it from SharePoint, perhaps backing it up in some type of way so that you can restore it in the future if necessary. I hope that helps.
That's fantastic, Randy. Thank you very much indeed. So, thank you again, Randy, for all your questions, or for taking these questions, and thank you to our attendees for posting the questions. So, remember, by being part of the European SharePoint community, you have unlimited access to a world of content, including blogs, webinars, how-to videos, and ebooks. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next webinar in October. Thank you very much, and goodbye.